Something felt wrong. The morning air was thick with dust, the kind that settled after something big had fallen. The usual quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the deep, rumbling growl of heavy machinery. Birds that once perched on rooftops were long gone, startled by the chaos unfolding below. Then came the crash. A deafening, gut-wrenching sound as a massive bulldozer plowed through a final standing wall. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. The very foundation groaned before collapsing into itself, leaving behind nothing but ruins. Where a home once stood, now only rubble remained. A black SUV pulled up, its tires grinding over broken pieces of a life that no longer existed. The door opened. A man stepped out, dressed sharply, his dark sunglasses concealing the storm brewing behind them. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the destruction. His name was Daniel Carter, and they had just bulldozed the wrong house. Gerald Whitman leaned back in his leather chair, fingers tapping rhythmically against his espresso cup. His office, filled with framed awards and certificates, was a reflection of his authority. He liked being in charge, enjoyed bending the rules to suit his vision of a perfect neighborhood. Another house gone meant another step closer to his ideal community, orderly, pristine, and completely under his control. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His secretary, Linda, peeked in hesitantly. "Ah, Mr. Whitman, there's someone here to see you." Gerald sighed, already bored. "Tell them to take it up with the appeals board. If they didn't follow the rules, that's their problem, not mine." Linda shifted uncomfortably. "I really think you should see him." Before Gerald could protest, the door swung open. A man stepped inside, his movements precise, controlled. He removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp, calculating eyes that locked onto Gerald like a predator sizing up its prey. "I want an explanation," Daniel Carter said, voice cold and firm. Gerald barely glanced up, unimpressed. "And you are the owner of the house your people just demolished." The air in the room thickened. Gerald hesitated for only a moment before flashing his well-practiced, dismissive smile. "I think you're mistaken," he said smoothly. "That property was abandoned. It violated multiple HOA regulations. If there's been an oversight, I'm sure we can come to some sort of agreement." Daniel didn't blink. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out a folded document, and placed it firmly on the desk. Gerald's smirk wavered as he unfolded the paper. There it was, clear, indisputable proof. The title deed. The house belonged to Daniel Carter. No violations. No unpaid fees. No legal grounds for demolition. For the first time, Gerald's confidence cracked. He quickly covered it with another wave of his hand. "Well, mistakes happen," he muttered. "You can file a complaint if you want, but the board has final say." Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice dangerously calm. "My home is gone. Everything in it is gone. Oops isn't going to cut it." Gerald chuckled, regaining some of his composure. "Look, Carter, we've dealt with plenty of upset homeowners before. If you think you're special, you're not." He set the deed down, crossing his arms. "Take it up with the system." Daniel studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Gerald exhaled, shaking his head. Just another angry homeowner. He had dealt with plenty of them before. He had no idea this one was different. Daniel Carter sat across from his attorney, Sarah Hayes, in a sleek downtown office. She flipped through the paperwork, her brows furrowed in disbelief. "This isn't just a property dispute," she said, tapping a page. "They didn't just destroy your home, they destroyed classified federal case files." Daniel nodded, his expression calm but unreadable. "Which means," he said, voice steady, "this isn't just a lawsuit. It's a federal security breach." Sarah leaned back, exhaling sharply. "They have no idea what they've done." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already made the necessary calls. The Department of Justice, the FBI, and the IRS were now paying close attention to Oak Ridge's HOA. Across town, in a well-lit conference room, Gerald Whitman stood at the head of a polished mahogany table, addressing the HOA board. His voice carried a smug confidence as he gestured toward a stack of files. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've taken another step toward improving our community. The removal of that property was necessary. Our neighborhood's value just went up." A few members nodded, sipping their coffee. Others clapped politely. But one board member, Steve, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His fingers drummed against the table before he finally spoke up. "Gerald, Are we sure that house was abandoned? I mean, did anyone? Gerald cut him off with a dismissive wave. Steve, the paperwork was processed. The demolition team did their job. If there was a mistake, they can take it up with our appeals process. He smirked. And we all know how well that works. Laughter rippled through the room, but Steve didn't smile. Something about this didn't sit right with him. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter was already moving. A judge had signed off on a temporary restraining order against the HOA, freezing all actions until further investigation. The HOA's bank accounts were now under federal review. No fines, no fees, no financial transactions of any kind. Gerald's phone buzzed in the middle of the meeting. He frowned at the unknown number but answered anyway. Whitman speaking. The voice on the other end was cool, controlled. Mr. Whitman, this is Agent Dawson from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We need to schedule a meeting regarding your HOA's legal operations. Gerald sat up straighter. Excuse me. You're under federal investigation. I'd suggest cooperating. The line went dead. Gerald's smug grin disappeared. Back at his office, Daniel Carter watched the chaos unfold from a distance. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The first move had been made. And it was only the beginning. Gerald Whitman sat at his desk, sipping his usual overpriced espresso. The morning had started like any other, smooth, controlled, and predictable. That changed the moment his phone rang. He barely glanced at the caller ID before answering. Whitman speaking. The voice on the other end was direct. Mr. Whitman, this is Mark Dawson from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We need to discuss irregularities in your HOA's accounts. Gerald blinked, sitting up straighter. Excuse me. There are discrepancies in HOA financial reports. Unexplained fund transfers. Inflated expenses. Suspicious withdrawals. Gerald forced a chuckle, though a pit formed in his stomach. I have no idea what you're talking about. Our books are clean. The agent's tone remained neutral. We'll see about that. We've already frozen your accounts pending investigation. No transactions will be processed until further notice. The espresso suddenly tasted bitter. You can't do that, Gerald snapped. We already have. The line clicked dead. Gerald stared at his phone, his fingers tightening around it. This was a joke. It had to be. He pressed the intercom. Linda, get our attorney on the line. Silence. Then a hesitant voice. Sir, she resigned this morning. The cup in Gerald's hand slipped, spilling coffee across his desk. Across town, Daniel Carter sat in a conference room with Sarah Hayes, watching as she flipped through pages of evidence. She looked up, eyes sharp. You were right. Their financials are a disaster. Illegal fines, fraudulent maintenance fees, money siphoned into private accounts. Daniel's expression remained unchanged. How deep does it go? Sarah tapped a page. They've been overcharging homeowners for years. Fake citations. Late fees that were never owed. The HOA board has been skimming from the top, hiding money in dummy corporations. It's straight-up embezzlement. Daniel nodded. And now? She smirked. The IRS is involved. Gerald slammed his office door shut, pacing furiously. This wasn't happening. Not to him. He had controlled Oak Ridge for years. He had fought off lawsuits before, crushed homeowners who dared challenge him. But this was different. His phone rang again. His banker this time. Mr. Whitman, the voice said, hesitant. Your accounts have been locked. The IRS issued a hold on all funds. Gerald's breath hitched. This is a misunderstanding. I'm afraid it's out of our hands. The investigation is ongoing. Gerald gritted his teeth. His perfectly managed empire was cracking, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, fear. He stormed out of his office and into the HOA boardroom. The members sat in hushed whispers, their faces tense. He slammed his hands on the table. We are not losing control. Steve, the nervous board member, swallowed hard. Gerald, the FBI is looking into us. The IRS, too. Maybe we should. Gerald cut him off. No, we hold our ground. We do not panic. Linda, his secretary, stepped forward, voice shaking. They are already pulling records. Deleting anything now would be obstruction of justice. Gerald's eyes darkened. Then we find another way. Before he could say another word, a loud knock echoed through the boardroom. 3 men in dark suits stepped inside. The one in front flashed a badge. Mr. Whitman, we have questions about your financial operations. For the first time in his life, Gerald had no answer. Gerald Whitman sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. His office, once a place of power, now felt suffocating. The blinds were drawn, but he could sense the world outside closing in. His mind raced for solutions, but none came. Then, a sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the room. He froze. The door swung open before he could respond. 3 men in dark suits stepped inside. The one in front held up a badge. "Mr. Whitman, we need to speak with you." Gerald forced a smile, though his palms were slick with sweat. "Gentlemen, this is highly unprofessional. If you have concerns, my legal team—" "Your legal team is no longer on retainer," the agent interrupted. "And this isn't a request." Behind them, more agents entered the HOA office. Employees whispered in hushed tones. Some clutched their belongings, as if realizing for the first time that their loyalty to Gerald had been misplaced. Across the parking lot, Daniel Carter leaned against his SUV, arms crossed. He watched as agents moved through the building, confiscating files, hard drives, and financial records. A small crowd of homeowners gathered at the entrance, murmuring among themselves. "Is this really happening?" one woman whispered. A man shook his head, eyes wide. "Holy crap, they're raiding the HOA." Inside, Gerald pushed back from his desk, forcing a chuckle. "Come on, this is ridiculous. A simple clerical error and you're storming my office." The lead agent's face remained unreadable. "You know exactly why we're here." 2 agents moved past him, one heading straight for the filing cabinet, the other to his computer. The moment they reached for the keyboard, Gerald snapped. "You can't just take that." He shot to his feet, voice rising. "This is private HOA business." The agent barely reacted. "Not anymore." A folder was opened. The contents, ledgers, altered financial reports, proof of fraudulent fines, were laid out on the desk. Gerald's stomach twisted as the reality hit him. They had everything. One agent pulled out a pair of handcuffs, stepping forward. "Gerald Whitman, you are under arrest for financial fraud, tax evasion, and destruction of federal property." Gerald's breath caught. "Wait, you can't." The cuffs clicked around his wrists. Outside, the crowd gasped as Gerald was led out of the building. Daniel watched, expression unreadable. As Gerald was guided past him, he turned, voice low. "You did this." Daniel didn't blink. "You did this to yourself." The agent nudged Gerald forward, leading him toward a waiting black SUV. As the door shut behind him, reality sank in. For the first time, Gerald Whitman was no longer in control. The Oak Ridge HOA was finished. Its once-feared board had crumbled, its corrupt president was in handcuffs, and its bank accounts were frozen. But Daniel Carter wasn't done yet. He stood on the empty lot where his home used to be. The ground was still uneven, remnants of rubble barely visible beneath fresh dirt. He could rebuild, start over exactly where he left off. But that wasn't enough. Daniel had a better idea. Within weeks, construction crews arrived, but not to lay the foundation for a new house. Instead, they worked to transform the space into something entirely different, a public park, open to all residents. At the entrance, a massive LED billboard was installed. And on it, footage of Gerald Whitman being arrested, playing on a continuous loop. Beneath it, a bronze plaque was placed, inscribed with the words, "In memory of every homeowner who suffered under the Oak Ridge HOA." The neighborhood watched in awe as the transformation unfolded. The once intimidating plot of land, marked by injustice, was now a symbol of victory. Families gathered, kids played, and for the first time in years, the community felt free. But Daniel wasn't finished yet. At a foreclosure auction, he purchased the HOA's old office building. The very place where homeowners had been fined, threatened, and bullied was now under his control. And he had the perfect use for it. Weeks later, a new sign was placed in front of the property. The old HOA headquarters had been converted into a dog park. The name? Gerald's Leash-Free Zone. The residents erupted in laughter when they saw it. The same man who had once ruled over them with an iron fist was now the unwilling namesake of a park for dogs to run free. Gerald, watching from a small, run-down apartment he could barely afford, seethed in silence. Everything he had built was gone. And Daniel Carter had made sure he would never forget it. Daniel Carter stood on his newly built porch, watching as the neighborhood thrived. Families laughed, children played, and for the first time in years, homeowners felt free. The oppressive rule of the HOA was over. Or so he thought. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Sarah Hayes. He answered, expecting good news. Instead, her voice was tense. Daniel. Gerald's out. His expression darkened. How? House arrest. His lawyers pulled some strings. He's not free, but he's not rotting in a cell either. Daniel exhaled slowly. And? Sarah hesitated. He's already meeting investors. Silence filled the line. Daniel's grip on his phone tightened. For what? A new HOA. He's looking at properties a few miles from here. No official name yet, but I found paperwork filed under Whitman Property Management. Daniel didn't move, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Gerald wasn't done. Not yet. He set the phone down and walked to his desk. His fingers traced the edge of a folder, fresh from the printer. A single red stamp marked the top. New target, Gerald Whitman. A slow smirk formed on his lips. Then, in a low voice, he muttered, I guess I'll have to pay him a visit. The screen fades to black.